We talk about full stack development, and honestly, full stack development has a lot of different moving parts, and we need to separate our concerns when we're building an app in the modern world. What are those concerns, though? Well, we've got the front end bits like the UI and whatever functions you're writing to support that UI. These are front end tools that are going to run in your browser, probably in JavaScript or tools like that. The decisions you make are very driven by your user. It's going to be custom branded, possibly purpose built for this very specific use, and then thrown away later. And you're going to have imagery and style sheets and things like that that are very specific to this experience, or all the way down to things being aware of what kind of device they're running on and changing and being very dynamic and driven by that function library, which manages the formatting, it manipulates data, it handles security for you when it needs to talk to the back end. And it should be, still customizable to support what we're trying to build and the problems at hand for this purpose-built solution. I also say it should be shareable because these libraries should be reusable to some extent, but on the front end. And we need to separate that concern from the back end, the API, the actual services that are doing the heavy lifting processing, and those data sources. These back end tools are more performance driven, response times and the scalability. And, are we able to reuse them and mix and match them different ways? They should be very generic and not be aware of what you're trying to do for the user on the front end. They should be the building blocks, and the building blocks can be mix and match. Now, keep in mind that API is sort of the piece that sits between the front end and those back end services. So it's acting as kind of a gatekeeper, managing things like identity, who's allowed to access this information and why. It's not handled in the function library. That's handled at the API because these rules need to be able to scale and change, and those building blocks need to be able to change. It also handles routing to different services. It might not be tightly coupled to one set of services, even in one data center. You might be using vendors or things like that. But to the UI, it should just talk to the one API. Now, when we go to those services, they should be tightly coupled with the data source. One service, one data source, best case. Obviously, there's still some orchestration that might have to happen where it has to reach out to different things, but it should be as tightly coupled as possible. And it formats that data in a response that can be understood by the API. Again, these services should be scalable, and they should still be security aware and identity aware because these things need to be audited in a way that you simply can't do on some of the front end tools. So that needs to be all bundled together in these back end tools. So that's a lot of information and bullet points thrown up here. So let's take a look at what does that mean? If you're going to build all of these different pieces, what are you going to have to do? So for one simple function, you're going to have your UI, and UI is going to call to those functions. So, something like Chrome or Safari is going to make a request to a library, some sort of function that in turn is going to make a request to the API. And it's going to have the security embedded in it so that it can be verified and that the thing is being requested in the right format and all that other stuff. Then that gets sent to the backend service, which in turn might have to grab some data, which then in turn might have to do a little bit more processing and orchestration or something like that, sending it back to the API, which then sends it back to the function library, where we once again have to do a little bit of formatting because we have to make it pretty for whatever that device or situation is that we have on the front end. And then we finally send that formatted response back to the UI where the user can view it. So when I talk about the separation of concerns, what I'm talking about is using that API as sort of that firewall. And that's an old school term, but it's the wall because the UI is all about making an exceptional experience to solve a business problem for your customers. And then those functions should be reusable things for tabular data or rendering maps or things like that. And also managing that security. So as long as it has the right keys to get through that lock at the API, then you can get to all that fancy data server stuff that happens out in the cloud. But in reality, from a front end development, you shouldn't even have to worry about that. And that's what I mean by separating your concerns.